Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet more Warhammer 40k lore of the Tyranid style. I know I literally talked about them just last week, but I've got an urge to do a bit more on the Gribblies, and I blame the fact that my chat over on the commentary channel recently funded me playing through Scorn, an old body horror style game. Well, old and old. Not recent. And whilst I was not particularly enthused by the game itself, it did succeed in making me feel like I was wandering through the corridors of a Tyranid bioship, so I'll blame that for the sudden urge for more Tyranids. Today, then, we are going to talk about the Tyranids' first arrival into the galaxy of the 41st millennium, which is, generally speaking, recorded as the Battle for Tyran, but technically, the Tyranids have been around for quite some time before that war. If you can even call the wholesale slaughter of an Adeptus Mechanicus outpost a war. They did, to be fair, make a good showing of it, but I won't be spoiling anything by stating that the Adeptus Mechanicus research outpost was not able to stop Hive Fleet Behemoth in its tracks. However, we are getting ahead of ourselves once again. The world Tyran was an ocean world, located way out on the very fringes of the 41st millennium's Milky Way galaxy. It had been established millennia ago by the Adeptus Mechanicus to keep an eye on this region of the eastern fringes, which was home to several planets with fascinating fauna and flora, usually of the hyper-aggressive variety. And at some point millennia ago, the Mechanicus probably figured that there were some lessons to be learned from these various jungle worlds, death worlds, and ocean worlds, teeming as they were with life in all manners of variants, sizes, and degrees of lethality. As contrary to popular belief, the Adeptus Mechanicus does carry out research efforts. It's just that it's heavily hampered by incredible quantities of unnecessary ritual, and is usually focused more on reverse engineering already existing Imperium and human technology rather than genuinely discovering something new. But nature, of course, well, it is but one of the countless domains over which mankind must assert its inevitable mastery. And so studying it for any potentially beneficial effects is entirely within the Adeptus Mechanicus' remit and realms of interest. However, in this particular case, something was very off. Obviously, the primary base on Tyran would be a central hub and gathering point for various exploration and research efforts deeper and wider into the eastern fringes. Small and large vessels would be dispatched from Tyran to keep a running catalogue of the fascinating flora and fauna on the various worlds surrounding it, as well as providing a repository of knowledge and a central operating hub for explorator vessels coming from deeper within the Imperium. The area that fell under the Tyran research station's purview would have been dozens upon dozens of solar systems, possibly as many as 100 or more. And during a routine patrol of these systems, various smaller explorator vessels found anomalies. Rather extreme anomalies, as planets that had been categorically proven to be practically bursting with life were now found dead. And no sort of usual death either, as Well, space is a dangerous place. Shit happens on occasion. Massive volcanic eruptions that cover the skies in ash, leading to the slow and painful demise of the majority of its biological organisms. Or extended ice ages. Or simply just stray rocks flying through space, slamming into the planet and wiping out the majority of its inhabitants. But there was no sign of any natural disaster on these worlds. In fact, there was no sign of any nature at all, as the planets had been reduced to nothing but barren, dead rocks spinning through space. Now, if there had been one planet like this, that would have been an extraordinarily intriguing anomaly that could perhaps have been explained by massive tectonic shifts, seeing the world's molten core bursting forth, perhaps a sizable enough impact to push it slightly out of its nearby star's orbit, causing the planet to simply be stripped of life. Possibly, but no. There were many examples of this exact same phenomenon, found entire solar systems distanced from one another. This was not merely strange, unusual, or anomalous, it was deeply implausible, according to all scientific and natural knowledge at the time. Now, we of course know that impossible is simply another word for hasn't happened yet. Especially when it comes to horrors beyond human comprehension. And the Adeptus Mechanicus were about to get a whole lot more closely acquainted with the business end of Cthulhu mythology than they had ever wanted to or hoped for. The various vessels that had been patrolling the surrounding space around Tyran now began reporting back to Tyran itself. But due to heavy and unusual, that'll be a repeating word here, interference, it was very difficult to establish any solid data links or contact with Tyran. Even astro-telepathic communication was somehow deadened, as if there was a great shadow in the warp, another impossibility. And even the messages and reports that did manage to make it back to Tyran, well, Magos Varnak obviously immediately went to work checking the data registries of the nearby systems for anything that resembled this phenomenon, but came up with the same as the vessels. Absolutely nothing. There was nothing that could cause this within this set of worlds. There was nothing in the entirety of the Imperium beyond exterminatus-grade weaponry that could cause this. And whilst it wasn't technically impossible that some random rogue inquisitor had been running around bombing planets, it seemed highly unlikely. No matter what had caused all of this, though, Magos Varnak quite sensibly came to the conclusion that it probably wasn't friendly, and ordered the world's defenses to be stood to and made ready as just a simple precaution. And being an extreme fringe research world under the auspices of the Adeptus Mechanicus, Tyran did have a pretty solid defensive roster, being protected, of course, by its own forces of thousands of Skitarii soldiers, along with an Imperial Guard regiment which had been hand-picked for this region of space. Catachan jungle fighters, well accustomed to fighting in the most lethal and aggressively hostile climates that the Imperium has to offer. Furthermore, Tyran itself was protected by 4 massive anti-orbital laser cannons that were in turn protected by dozens of point defense flak towers, bristling with auto and las cannons. The research station also boasted an airfield, ably equipped with 2 squadrons of Imperial fighters, a mixed group of Thunderbolts and Lightnings. The Skitarii and Catachan jungle fighters could also no doubt rely on solid ceramite walls, along with bunkers, pre-prepared killing zones, firing lanes, and, of course, the very nature of Tyran itself, an enormous ocean world. The research station was spread out over a series of volcanic islands, creating fortresses rising from the various peaks of the island chain, each one easily defensible, each one massively armored, and protected. And if anything tried to land in the oceans, well, Tyran was also famous for having an excessively hostile biosphere, boasting all the usual small and mid-sized ocean predators, along with titanic super predator life forms. So uniquely, horrifyingly dangerous were these things, the Mechanicus figured it was worth to establish a research outpost all the way out here on the eastern fringes. And even that is not the end of it, as Tyran also boasted 3 Endeavour-class light cruisers, although in reality that designation is a gross misnomer, as the Endeavour class is basically never actually used as a light cruiser, nor is it suited for the purposes of a light cruiser. It's too fat and too slow for any sort of real anti-piracy operations, nor is it much of an escort vessel either, not being particularly agile. In essence, the Endeavour class is a system monitor. It is relatively easy to produce, being little more than a ginormous void-born slab of metal and guns, and it is heavily armed and armored, again way beyond the tonnage of any light cruiser. And so it is used instead as system defense crafts, or for very, very local escort. It is intended to be stuck within a solar system, but it can patrol it to a degree, but it isn't expected to go particularly far. And in an ideal scenario, the Endeavour will simply stick its arse solid in high geostationary orbit above any and all anti-orbital defenses on the planet below, and sit there, daring any enemy to take on both the planet's and the cruiser's significant armaments at the same time. And Tyran had 3 of these monitors: the Emperor's Fist, the Righteous Destiny, and the Sword of Warriors. Now, all of this really is rather excessive for a single fringe world, but as we've talked about a little while ago, research worlds are considered particularly important and valuable, thus the sheer tonnage of defenses on display. The preparations of Magos Varnak was, however, about to be very, very sorely tested. And the only reason the world even knew that it was about to get eaten was because one of the returning explorator vessels ran into an unidentified hazard near the edges of the system's warp translation point. The ship had just recently arrived when it hit something or other that exploded. However, there was no metallic signature, there was no particular heat signature, it didn't seem like they'd been hit by a weapon, nor had the hull been impacted in such a way as to suggest a meteor or some regular hazard. Instead, the ship reported back that parts of the hull had melted. It just keeps getting better and better. And after a little bit more observation, it was determined that the ship had just barely skimmed the outermost layers of an enormous spore cloud of biological organisms moving in a vast sphere towards Tyran. The mystery, at least, was about to be resolved, supposedly, although again, the poor defenders had no idea what was about to hit them, as at this point in time, the Imperium Well, technically it did know about Tyranids, but it didn't know that that is what they were. See, as we talked about in the Tyranid Hive Fleet video, the fleet, Behemoth, would undoubtedly have dispatched vanguard organisms long before it actually entered the Milky Way galaxy. At the very least, they would have been there for centuries, as the earliest known report of what we would later realize were Tyranids happened around 150 to 250 years before the action on Tyran. At the time, these creatures were dubbed Imgarl, and they would later be recognized as a species of gene stealers. At the time, it was simply assumed to be a very hostile and aggressive and expansionistic xenospecies without a whole lot of a higher intelligence. It is very rare for aggressive xenospecies without intelligence to manage to get from one planet to another, as, traveling through space is usually hard. But it is far from unheard of. And so the fact that the Imgarl gene stealers had been spotted on multiple worlds was not in and of itself necessarily a sign that they were, truly mobile or a massive threat. As, again, whilst it is rare, there are examples of animals capable of traveling through the warp, even. So, unusual, but not in and of itself categoric evidence of anything. Now, these were of course the only ones we actually knew about, and it is entirely possible, if not indeed even likely, that Tyranid vanguard scout organisms had arrived in the 40k galaxy maybe as much as a millennia before the action on Tyran. We can suggest this for a couple of reasons. One, the fleet that emerged in Tyran and was now heading towards the planet did not immediately head towards Tyran, which is a pinch unusual because it was a huge ocean world which would have been absolutely resplendent in biomass. Furthermore, the Tyranid Hive fleet had seemingly been avoiding Imperial patrols, Imperial relay stations, outposts, and other things that might have given away its presence. Now, it's entirely possible that it was all by sheer undiluted accident. This was still a significant portion of space, after all, and it was only partially patrolled by Adeptus Mechanicus vessels, checking in on various worlds and making sure that nothing weird had happened, like, with the Tau, for example. Weird shit does happen out in space, and the Mechanicus is more than aware of that. However, with the sheer size of Behemoth, it seems unlikely that it would have managed to dodge discovery for as long as it did without at least a degree of intent and guile on its own behalf. Even more so, as the Tyranid fleet will almost certainly have simply spread out and eaten as many worlds as possible, rather than staying together, unless it was anticipating some form of resistance or danger inherent in being spotted early. Again, this is speculatory, but it seems to make a certain degree of sense. Now, all of this also suggests a significant degree of intelligence on the target world and this portion of the 41st Millennium's galaxy, which again suggests plenty of already infiltrated gene stealer organisms and presumably vanguard ships spreading them throughout Imperial space as well. And it would also just simply make sense for any predatory species that functions in the way the Hive Fleet does to dispatch scouts as far ahead of the main fleet as possible to make sure that they weren't going to arrive to any unfortunate surprises. And self-evidently, the Tyranid Hive fleet now decided that it had gathered enough biomass to refuel itself after its very long journey across the vast gaps between galaxies to take on its first little challenge. A quick test run before the serious business of engaging a pretty heavily defended part of the Imperium began. As of course, next up after this was Ultramar. Anyways, the defenders, still having basically no clue what they were up against, simply engaged their usual standard defensive practices. The small defensive fleet of, in essence, monitor ships, the Endeavour-class light cruisers, assumed geostationary orbit far, far above the planet of Tyran. There they waited for the enemy to come and engaged them with their own weapon batteries at maximum range. Fortunately for the defenders, at least temporarily that is, the incoming vessels proved fairly susceptible to Imperial weaponry, as dozens of vessels began to assault the planet and the warships in orbit. These ships were like nothing anyone had ever seen before. Organic vessels of enormous size, to the point where they easily dwarfed anything that could be found on the planet down below, which in and of itself was a study in titanic life forms. They were engaging the ships in orbit with vast talons and beak-like protrusions, along with the same acidic mine things that had struck the smaller Explorator-class vessels. They also were seen vomiting forth bilous acidic weaponry towards the ships. All of this, however, was relatively easily dealt with. The acidic bile traveled quite slowly through the void of space, allowing even the Endeavours to move out of the way back and forth with minimum maneuvering as they kept their stations. And the few stray globulates that struck them were easily absorbed by the significant armor of the Endeavour-class ships. The charging vessels themselves also proved to be quite susceptible to Imperial weaponry, and within an hour of active and heavy shooting, the enemy appeared to be withdrawing. The anti-orbital lasers, planetside, were getting a bit strained at this point, but they still had ample energy left. If anything, it was the weapons barrels themselves that might give out due to repeated firing. But the ships in orbit were doing just fine. The smaller spores were easily engaged and destroyed by point defense weaponry. The enemy's warships appeared to be nothing particularly special, and so the order was given for the three ships to pursue the seemingly routed foe, hoping to destroy them before they themselves could devour any more planets. Eagerly, the captains obeyed orders, diving into the vast spore swarm to pursue their foe before they could escape their sensors. As the biggest trouble so far was actually finding something to shoot at, which, considering the sheer number of targets, sounds absurd, but the only way to find a target was to use good old-fashioned enhanced optics or very low-level heat readings. Nothing like what the Imperial Navy would normally be looking for, as obviously a massive spaceship puts off a lot of heat, even whilst running relatively silent, whereas these things, well, it's just a living organism. Its heat output compared to a warship would be beyond minuscule. So, making sure not to lose track of the enemy, the three warships pursued the fleeing foe, deep into the vast spore cloud of small organic mines. These were expected to not be too much of a threat, as they could easily be destroyed by the point defense weapons on the Endeavour-class cruisers. The problem, however, was that the cloud of spores had been serving a far more important purpose by obfuscating the enemy behind the spores. As once the Imperial warships got into the cloud, they realized that the dozens or so vessels that they had already destroyed was but the merest fraction of a tendril, as there were thousands of additional ships within the spore cloud, many of which absolutely dwarfed the earlier ships. Realizing their mistake, the 3 Endeavour-class cruisers attempted to turn and flee, but as we've already mentioned, speed and maneuverability is not the strong suit of an Endeavour. In essence, little more than orbital defense monitor. And the 3 vessels were quickly overcome, latched onto, boarded, and destroyed, with only one of them managing to send a last pointless warning to Tyran. I imagine the mood on the planet was not particularly elated at this point, now understanding that they were up against thousands of these vessels, and still having had no real idea of what they would do to the world itself. Would they simply begin drinking the oceans dry? Would they deploy some sort of orbital weaponry? They were clearly biological, so some sort of biological threat, perhaps? A plague, like the virus bombs of the Imperium? They didn't need to wait long to find out. Soon, the enemy warships resumed their orbital positions, and the anti-orbital batteries opened up yet again, still proving very effective against the invading ships, capable of gutting several more, as they began deploying vast spore clouds down onto the planet. Millions upon millions of organisms were seemingly falling out of the heavens. Initial analysis suggested that these were likely some form of drop pods or landing devices, majority of which simply pounded into the ocean surrounding the Explorator station. Those aimed at the stations themselves, well, volcanic islands, difficult enough to hit to begin with, and guarded by dozens of flak towers bristling with defensive weaponry. The majority of these pods were simply blown apart long before they struck the actual bases themselves. And the few that did hit were easily destroyed by emplaced automated guns, by the Skitari defenders, or the Catachan jungle fighters. More interestingly, however, to Magos Varnak and the other Magos biologists on the world, were all the pods falling into the ocean. Initially, everyone was overjoyed. Surely the organisms would simply drown, and indeed, the initial organisms almost certainly did, until the feedback went up to the Tyranid hive fleet, and later waves were more amphibious, adequately prepared for the oceans below. Then the defenders simply assumed that the local predators would have a huge feast on their hands, and once more, initially, they did. Until the Tyranids evolved again to begin eating the predators, until the seas around the research outpost was practically boiling red, with vast tides of blood extending as far as the eye could see, as vast carcasses of leviathan creatures considered utterly unmatched in their predatory ferocity began rising to the surface, even as they were cut apart and devoured by thousands of smaller warrior organisms. But even if the invaders were proving themselves superior antagonists to the creatures in the deep, dark depths, they were clearly faring significantly worse against the civilized defenders. Due to the 3-tier interception network thrown up over the Adeptus Mechanicus outpost, virtually none of the enemies were actually getting through. At the highest level, the anti-orbital batteries were still damaging and presumably killing, destroying enemy bioships. Further down in the atmosphere, the thunderbolts and lightnings were effectively engaging and destroying most of the landing pods. And at the bottommost level, the point defenses, flak batteries, and the defenders themselves were killing anything that got through. It seemed that at this rate, so long as ammunition didn't start becoming a problem. The defenders could hold out near indefinitely against this animalistic offensive. And that may well have been true if it was truly just dumb animals. But shortly thereafter, the first of the orbital defense batteries went silent. Not because it had been effectively engaged by the enemy's warships, not because the orbital battery itself had been compromised or its defenses destroyed. No, because the barrel had eventually been clogged with the corpses of small flying enemy organisms, which would later be designated as gargoyles, clogging up the weapon to the point where if fired now, it would simply detonate the entire complex. This allowed for a significant hole in the defenses to open up, through which further organisms began to swarm, until a second battery was targeted as well by larger enemy organisms, living battering rams in essence, charging through ceramite walls and destroying the power conduits leading to a second orbital battery. Now the skies were significantly less dangerous for the invaders, and more ships moved into orbit and began disgorging yet further attackers. Millions of these pods began raining down onto the defenders, more than the intercept network could conceivably deal with. And worse still, the thunderbolts and lightning, already having been up and down and back up into the sky again, time and time again, were now beginning to run into actual resistance. Enemy flyers, the aforementioned gargoyles, and far larger creatures, later to be designated harpies, were now engaging the thunderbolts and lightnings. Individually, they were no match whatsoever for the technologically advanced Imperial defenders, but there was nothing individual about them, of course. And one by one, the Imperial flyers were brought down, either by bursts of venomous crystals blasting apart next to their aircraft, filling them with acidic slivers, or having their air intakes choked full by spores or even flying enemy creatures, until 2 out of 3 of the intercept networks were down, leaving only the soldiers on the ground, the Skitarii, and the Kathazan jungle fighters, along with any automated defenses or flak towers to resist the deluge. It was never going to be even remotely close to enough. As whilst the defenders were still relatively capable of stopping the pods landing directly on top of their outposts, the enemy was now beginning to pour in from the ocean as well. Hundreds of thousands of organisms climbing the walls from every direction. And even as tens of thousands of them were scythed off the walls by last fire, by fragmentation grenades, by autocannons and heavy bolters, it was simply never going to be enough. And every time a group reached the top of the walls, they created another entry point, hastening the collapse of the defenses at large. The Skitarii were soon beginning to be overwhelmed. The Kathazan jungle fighters, resisting the enemy with flamethrowers, shotguns, and even knives and bare hands were necessary, were also beginning to be scattered. Organized resistance ceased, as it was every man for himself, every bunker, every firing position, desperately holding out against an ever-increasing number of enemy organisms. Not to mention the fact that they were getting a lot bigger as well. Ensconced in the highly temporary safety of the central bunker complex, Magos Varnak saw the rest of his command begin to collapse around him. As loud slamming noises could be heard from the entrance to the central bunker, it was by now very, very evident that no further resistance was possible. Gathering up all of the logs, the data, the audio files, and whatever information they had managed to gather on the attackers, a data crypt was finally created and then plunged into the deepest, most heavily armored depths of the command bunker, in the hopes that someone would be able to benefit from the lessons of Tyrannus. It seemed a feeble hope, as very little of the planet would be left after the enemy were done with it. But it was all the Magos could do, and the Adeptus Mechanicus are, if nothing else, a stickler for the rules. Turning away from his console to try and sell his own life as dearly as the machine god would allow him, the final few defenders were torn apart by further waves of hostile organisms rushing in, before the planet was drained dry of all of its moisture, its countless biological organisms devoured and fed back up into the hive fleet above. The cost of Tyrannus had no doubt been significant. Whether or not the Tyranid hive fleet broke even, considering the bioships destroyed as well, is difficult to fully guess at, but probably it did, as Behemoth was named thusly for a reason, its sheer size and weight of numbers. However, the Magos' final desperate gambit would in fact pay off, as about a standard year or so after the complete and utter destruction of his command, the data vault was retrieved by one Inquisitor Fidus Cryptman, who would go on to become the Imperium's leading expert on the Tyranid threat, and its most effective antagonist as well. It was he who would come up with the simple, if brutal, solution to burn entire planets ahead of the advancing Tyranid hive fleet, allowing the defenders to sell their lives as dearly as possible before virus bombing the entire thing. A strategy that would only seem reasonable coming from an Imperial Inquisitor. And it was, of course, he as well that dubbed this threat the Tyranid threat, in honor of the brave and not actually quite futile sacrifice of the defenders of Tyran. They gave the Imperium a fighting chance, through Inquisitor Cryptman, through their data, and eventually, of course, Behemoth would be shattered on the shield of Macragge. But that was still quite some time left to come. Or, well, depending on the source you're quoting, that is, as some apparently suggest that this happened, well, before Cryptman even arrived, which would be rather impressive, whilst others place it at least half a century or so later. But you know how GW is with dates and all that. Regardless, a threat to all life had arrived in the galaxy, one that no one recognized, not even those who might have seen it before. Depending upon your view on the origins of the Tyranid threat and the war in the heavens. And even if the Eldar knew of the Tyranids, they clearly felt no pressing need to inform the Imperium of the nature of these creatures. And to be fair, the Eldar are already on the shit list. Oh yes, by the way, whoopsie poopsie, those galaxy-spanning locusts devouring absolutely everything, they may or may not have been somehow connected to us in a long bygone time. You might think they could simply explain it, but The Imperium, too, is not known for its forgiving or understanding nature, particularly not in situations involving a threat to everything. Oh well. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see all of you again very, very soon, with hopefully something other than the Tyranids. Don't worry, I'm probably not going to be required to replay Scorn anytime soon. Have a good day.